Thank you everyone for joining our quarterly Cybersecurity Insider Program webinar. Today we're joined by Bill Reid of Google and Tim Quigley, our Chief Client Officer here at CloudWave. And I'll hand it over to Tim to do some introductions and get us started today.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for everyone who took time out of their busy schedule to join us today. We appreciate that. We have, we think, a great learning session for everyone. We've been working with Google over probably the last year in terms of building out some of our cybersecurity capabilities here at CloudWave, and one of the real pleasures of that experience has been getting to know Bill Reid. Bill Reid has had a long career in healthcare, cybersecurity, working with Amazon, Microsoft, and a number of other places. I could read through his CV, but I think that would take up all of the time. It is an impressive array of credentials and experiences, and having met a lot of folks over the years who have incredible credentials, but then when you meet them in person, it just doesn't quite live up to the hype. I can guarantee you that is not the case with Bill. And in particular, one of the things that we think is great is he shares the passion for securing hospitals, and particularly community hospitals, rural access hospitals, who are frankly struggling the most these days with an absolute epidemic of cybersecurity crime. So I also have Mike Donahue, our Chief Operating Officer, who works every day helping secure our clients, to answer questions and give a little bit of his experience. But first, we will turn it over to Bill, who is going to give his presentation with a key focus on his Defender's Advantage theory. So without much further ado, I will turn it over to Bill.
Awesome. Hey, thank you. I'm very embarrassed by that intro. So I'm gonna spend some time today talking about this concept of the Defender's Advantage, and we'll spend some time kind of digging into this, and then what's this mean and how do we realize it? But what are the ways to kind of think about this from a defensive perspective? I'm going to start just by giving this definition. This is how we tend to think about the Defender's Advantage, right? It's this idea that, and sometimes it doesn't feel like this, honestly, right? It doesn't feel like we have an advantage. We commonly hear well, we have to be right all the time. They only have to be right once, right? The idea here with Defender's Advantage is to try to shift a little bit the way that we think about the perspective of defense, and thinking about this as that, the attacker is actually coming into our place, and that in theory, we should actually have the advantage. They're the systems that we bought, we put in place, we configured, the identities that we manage. And so the challenge then becomes one of, how is it that we can reassert control and maintain the advantage that we ought to have, right? I kind of think about this, another way of explaining this would be to think about Kevin McAllister in Home Alone, where, he had the Defender's Advantage, right? And successfully defended his home against would-be thieves that were going to go and pillage their house over Christmas time. So, if you're sitting there struggling, think about, channel your inner Kevin, and think about what it is that we can do to take advantage of the innate capabilities and understanding we have of our own environments. This is just a little bit about me. One of the things that I have a great joy in doing is working in the office of the CISO here at Google Cloud. We're a group of people who are former CISOs and security leaders from a variety of different industries. And I think what makes Google, a little different in our approach to offices of the CISO, is that we decided right from the beginning that we would tend to take this vertical oriented approach and bring people from the industries in which they had served and bring them into a group here at Google and have them continue to work with people in the industry. And so I began my career actually as a healthcare administrator long ago in what is presently today Kaiser Permanente, and my job was very early on working with clinical teams to help them do quality improvement, and I like internal consulting to doctors and nurses, and eventually ended up running emergency care and internal medicine, some other things, and that was really the beginning of my career. So this is home, right? Healthcare is my industry, and so I've had the opportunity to spend some time working at some of the other large technology companies, and then having the opportunity to put on the CISO hat a few times in companies of varying sizes, and the most recently serving as VP and Chief Security Officer for a biomanufacturing company making biologics. And that was really the first time where what I really wanted to do is bring a unification together of physical, IT, and operational technology, because really often we divide those, we treat them separately, and I felt that really wasn't something that was a good situation, and in many cases they're self-reinforcing, particularly in a manufacturing operation where you've got plants. I also spent some time continuing to work in healthcare-related stuff with direct trust and other things. I'm going to talk about these domains of IT security, and this is a definition that we take here with Google Cloud and Mandiant. Lots of people can divide the domain into lots of different ways. We're going to use this as kind of the organizing framework, and we're going to drill in on cyber defense for today's conversation. But that isn't to say that there aren't other important disciplines, whether it's areas associated with governance of security, so policies, procedures, what we are and aren't going to do, standards that we have around that, security risk management, including third-party risk management, how we're looking at our suppliers and our supply chain, looking at resiliency in that regard, and then security architecture, that is everything from how we design the networks and systems to what we do in terms of software development lifecycle and kind of secure practices for developing products. But today, what we're going to do is spend our time really diving into this area of cyber defense. And we're going to kind of talk about this in terms of these 6 functions. And I'm going to dig into each of these as we go through this. But kind of think about these as all reinforcing, right? They're designed, and this perspective that I'm going to share is really designed that these are interlocking and intersupporting sets of capabilities. Very early on, when I began being a CISO for the first time, I tended to look at what I would probably call not threat-informed defense, but compliance-informed defense. Right? So I looked at it and I said, well, I'm going to be held to be compliant with a variety of different regimes. And so I better make sure that the control selections and what I do is aligned with what expectations I would have under HIPAA, for example. And while that's important, what I often found is that I was designing for compliance and not necessarily the threat landscape that I was facing, right? And so what we're going to talk a little bit about in this perspective is really pivoting that from, yes, you have to satisfy compliance obligations. You might have to be high trust certified. You might have, if you're a covered entity or business associate, you've got to meet HIPAA's requirements. If you're in other jurisdictions, you got to meet those, right? So not to say that's not important, but I want to shift that perspective to think about defense as really being intelligence informed. We talk about it as being this guiding light. The notion here is that really what we want to have is intelligence or threat intelligence informed defense decisions, right? And so what we want to think about is how we cultivate that. That permeates through and really is the context in which all of the other work happens. And that includes our ability to detect. So what are we doing from a monitoring and investigation perspective, our ability to respond when we see things that concern us in terms of validating our controls against probable or possible threats, hunting our environments to see if we have been compromised or could be compromised given changes in attack behavior, and then just generally how we maintain the mission and coherence and management over all of it. And so really it begins in this area of kind of thinking about intelligence as this fundamental guiding light. Often what happens is that we subscribe to a variety of threat intel. We may get this from an ISAC, we may get it from other types of news services, other types of threat intel. And that's great, right? But that's only one piece of it. Getting it is one piece. It doesn't really do anything if I don't actually action it. And so the whole idea here is to think about how we encourage this intelligence life cycle. And it really starts with this idea of planning and direction. What is it that we're going to do? What is the business in which we find ourselves? Where do we operate? Do we have areas of operational technology interfacing with informational technology? I will say that if you run a hospital or a healthcare organization, the answer to that is yes. And you'd sit there and go, wait, we're not a manufacturer. You have HVAC systems, you have building management and control systems, you have physical access control systems. You have a variety of intersections with operational technology that very often aren't thought about and aren't brought to the table. And so the idea here is to look at that and say, whoa, we might be operating in a space that is bigger or has different stakeholders, and that may drive the kind of intelligence that we collect. And if it turns out that we run an operational technology portion of our business in terms of buildings and structures and medical devices, but we don't get any threat intel in those categories, then we're not really going to have what we need to be able to understand the kinds of threats that we face in our environment. The next is really collecting this, and that's gathering those data and making sure that we have what we need from a curated perspective. And then it feeds into an analysis process. And that analysis process is really making meaning out of that, putting some context in, and turning that into produced intelligence that we then do things with, right? And so production may lead to briefings with leadership or the board. This may mean incorporation or adjustments in the telemetry that we do in detection, which we'll talk about shortly. It may mean what we do in terms of the kind of communication to employees about awareness. It may mean cross collaboration with peers to try to understand if they're seeing any kind of practices in these regards. So we're kind of turning that in, and there's that dissemination and feedback. And then what we want to learn is, in the course of that, was that helpful? And so we always want to be in this feedback cycle and of intelligence life cycle. We want to be thinking, well, was that helpful, or did we have blind spots? Is there areas that we needed to supplement our threat intelligence? And so think about it as intelligence driven. It really is what moves us in a direction and guides a lot of the investment decisions and control decisions that we have. It's really out of this that we kind of think about this notion of a cyber threat profile, which really is this intersection of thinking about this threat landscape, right? It's looking at that intelligence. It's understanding who we are, how we operate, the threats posed to businesses differ based on the kind of business that you're in. What you're exposed to and the potential impact can be different depending on how you're organized, what your physical structures look like, the care systems that you operate. And then there's kind of an impact. What would be the impact of an attack? And if it was an impact, it might be, well, one impact is that we have to resort to paper. Another impact is that we can't pay people. Another impact is that our HVAC system shut down and we don't have control of our environment and we have to vacate patients. And so those impact, we kind of look at those and we really want to think about this kind of cyber profile. Think about it as, what is it that we really want to think about in our intelligence, and how we want to organize our kind of this effort of understanding the threats that we face into our company. We're then really spending time with this threat intel, the CTI, of activating it, right? We want to make sure that it's informing efforts, and it's really cascading this through a variety of these additional areas of activity, right? It's going to help inform the practices that we do. Again, remember, this isn't just about meeting compliance obligations. This is really thinking about what are the tactics, techniques, and procedures that threat actors that are active right now employing. And that helps us then think about, well, how would we look for indicators of compromise or activity in our environment? What if we didn't have the right telemetry, and now we subsequently have to go and understand whether we've been breached? We can start to prioritize vulnerabilities. If the primary entry point are exploits, well, we'd want to understand the kinds of exploits that those threat actors are taking, so that we can make sure that from a patching perspective, we're prioritizing those first. We want to be thinking about, the controls that we need to put in place. What kind of monitoring? Do we need to update telemetry? Do we need to write new detections based on some of this? And then we want to be thinking about how we're going to communicate. Do we need to update, for example, our response plans? Do we need to take run books and modify those based on what we're seeing in terms of these threat actor behaviors? If a threat actor is changing and has a set of tactics, techniques, and procedures that involve data leak sites, we might want to increase our ability to monitor for data leaks, right? Be looking at brand disclosures where somebody's maybe leaked something, because that's now part of our telemetry set, if that tends to be the main way that an attacker is exploiting us in terms of trying to get leverage or something like that. And so that's what we're doing. We want to put that threat intel actually into work. The next area that we really think about is detecting, right? We want to detect. It's great that we have threat intel. It's great that we have telemetry, but we want to marry them up. And what we want to think about is, and if those of you that have ever done like static code analysis, you get lots of false positives, really noise, right? Or you're trying to do log aggregation and log analysis. It's sometimes trying to find, needles in haystacks, and really, or as I heard somebody once say, needles in piles of needles. We're trying to find things that stand out, that are things that we need to go and do something about, right? So we're detecting, because what we're trying to do is maintain a secure operation. And so we want these detections to be appropriately tuned to the types of threats we face, either as a sector or a type of business. And so we're doing this, and that helps inform how we're creating visibility, right? Detections that we're writing, authoring in these tools. The next thing that we want to do is to think about how we're responding to these compromises. So now let's say we see signal and we go, okay, that is something of concern. And at that point, what we have to do is to start thinking about this response cycle. So what is it that we need to do immediately from a containment perspective, right? So how is it that we take advantage of isolation and the isolation capabilities, right? And to the degree that we've planned ahead and done good segmentation and segregation of work, we can exercise that, right? That we don't have to shut the entire business off from the internet. We have the ability to think carefully about what quarantines or what kinds of activities we need to do to contain activity to still keep the business operable, right? In healthcare, we got to keep patient care going, right? We can't stop. And so what we need to do is to think about, is there a containment? Can we put a perimeter around this and get kind of back to business? Then the next activity, once we've done this, is really thinking about what are we going to do from a restoration perspective? Do we know how to respond to bring services back and do that in a careful way, right? So that we don't suffer reinfection. This is where it becomes important to really understand, together with our monitoring telemetry detection capabilities, when we might have first seen threat actor behavior, right? When do we know we have clean backups? When do we know that we can restore? Where is the boundary of infections so that we're really focused on appropriate restoration in those capacities? And sometimes that restoration of service begins on paper, and some of that restoration continues after that fact by backloading what may have been paper charting back into the HR system if that was the compromised system. The next area is eradication. And one of the things that we often see in our M-Trends report is that in some cases, not an insignificant percentage of them, is that there's improper cleanup. That means that we haven't eliminated or eradicated the threat actor from the environment, that they found a way of either living off the land or persisting somehow in that environment. And now we have to, we need to make sure that we've properly eliminated the threat actor's ability to re-exploit us, right? So, you know, kicking us when we're down in some respects. After we've gone through an event, we don't want them to reactivate that attack and cause further disruption. Aside from it being a lot of work, it's incredibly demoralizing on staff. And so that eradication effort goes, and that's really, in many respects, can be supported by threat hunting type of activity. The final is security enhancement. We're going to learn, right? So again, you'll hear this construct of feedback cycle. Security enhancement is really, are we learning from what we just experienced? What didn't work? We'll find, for example, boy, we didn't do good subnetting. We didn't have the right, you know, kind of segmentation that we could do. We didn't have visibility into something. We didn't understand, or, you know, we didn't have our backups labeled properly. So we fumbled around to try to figure out which ones we could use, et cetera, right? We're going to learn in that, and that's further going to feed our response processes. We update run books, we update detections, we do a number of different things, and we learn from that process. The next thing that we want to do in this area of defense is to really thinking about validation of our controls. So we've got, we may have established a set of controls, we've got telemetry in place, but we need to actually test it, right? We need to see that a finding is going to trigger, or telemetry is going to trigger appropriately or an alert by testing it, right? We want to see, does it fire, as opposed to hoping. We want to make sure that we have the ability to understand that those controls are working, and that we have the ability to not only do this on technical controls, but we want to be thinking about this as well from a process, procedure, and people. And so this is often where we may say, you know what, we've got a plan, but did we really test not the backup, but the entire run book associated with this, so that the people that are supposed to execute all know how to do it? Not just we ran a restoration of a backup. Do we have the opportunity to really test that all the way through so that people understood what it is that they needed to do in order to fully exercise that process? And that validation cycle is something that helps you ensure that you're able to do that. Not only, again, testing physical controls, but and digital controls, but human controls as well. And a lot of it is drilling through. This is often where having the ability to do things like tabletop exercises, and making those tabletop exercises actually incorporate real telemetry. So using the full capabilities of your detection systems and your response systems in that validation work in a tabletop exercise, so that people are familiar with when it actually happens, and not like, it's not this vague esoteric tabletop exercise with narrative. It's actually using the artifacts that they would look at in a real event, and running through that process as close as you can. Now, I'm not saying bring your environment down and do it that way, but it's really about how can we validate through this exercise of generating these kind of integration points. The next area is hunting. And hunting is a way for us to learn about where we may have exposures that we aren't quite aware of. And so in some ways, you can kind of think about hunting as a form of the practice of red teaming, right? It's a way of taking the threat intel that we have and trying to understand how that threat actor might navigate their way through. And so we're looking at the TTPs, or those methods by which they execute, and look at that within our environment, right? And we're looking for ways of understanding, would we have measured, would we have captured and alerted on activity that the threat intel would have informed us about, right? Do we have that? And then we have the opportunity to be thinking about how do we then fix our environment, right? So we're going through this hunting activity. It also helps the defenders be thinking about attacker behavior, right? We don't necessarily want to say, hey, think like a defender, but it is a way of modeling our threats in our environment and then thinking through whether those are actually, can they be realized? And would we know? And then that further informs what we set up in the other categories of detection and response. Threat hunting process typically is this notion of starting with a hypothesis, right? And then working through this, kind of scoping out what we're going to do, going and looking at the environment. We're really acquiring data about that environment, evaluating those results, and then determining what we learned in the course of that. So again, this kind of cycle of activity that then helps us inform this. And this might lead to further hypotheses. Sometimes this can be an incredibly helpful activity for doing things like detecting long indwelling or living off the land types of exploits as well. Last category is mission control. And this is, a way of knowing, can we maintain governance through this process? Now, earlier we had security governance at that bigger drawing. Well, this is looking at it within this construct of defense. Do we have the ability to understand and communicate appropriately? Do people know how to act? Do we have, this notion of authority to act? Do people feel like they are empowered to act? And do we give them the capability to act? Meaning, do they have keys? Do they have credentials? Do they have systems on which they could actually execute all of those response and detection activities? How are we going to communicate with not only internally in our organization, among the security organization, but with business owners in the various lines of business or service owners in the clinical services? This is also an area where, how will we integrate or understand what's happening with trading partners? So if you think about something that happened with respect to Change Health, what's happening in the broader ecosystem that may have an impact on us, and how are we going to capture that and learn from what we're seeing out there and communicating among our trading partners, and then communicate that back into this environment? And what role do we play from a governance perspective at bringing that kind of information in so that proper decisions could be made? Okay. Take a quick breath. And I'm going to cover two additional areas that are a little bit of a special category that tends to come up. The first is this area. Yeah.
And Bill, why don't I will let you take a breath. And I just I forgot to say something at the start, which is, if folks have questions, we're going to try and get in questions at the end. If you put them into the chat, Chris or I will read them off for Bill at the end, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. So that seemed like a good spot for that little correction of mine. I'll turn it back to Bill.
Awesome. Thank you. You let me get a sip of some water here. So, okay, I'm going to go talk about AI, because this comes up in lots of conversations. And people say, well, okay, what about AI? And really the idea with AI is how do we bring it into cyber defense? And what you'll find is increasingly it's really twofold, and at least two. Okay. One is that very often now we're having to defend AI model serving systems. And that includes really four fundamental elements. The one element of this is really focused on data, right? And how do we protect data? How do we protect the models that we're using, the model weights? How do we protect the infrastructure that is serving these models? And then also, finally, how do we protect the applications that are really the services in which we're interacting, our users are interacting with models? And so it's really thinking about how do we kind of understand those component pieces and then design them into this kind of architecture so that we have the right telemetry around the data protections, around the infrastructure controls, around the model serving and IP controlling environments, what we're doing on application security and telemetry around application behavior. I want to be thinking about all of that and bringing that into this perspective. We're trying to protect that kind of work, and that's whether that's models directly or whether those are models that are incorporated in clinical applications or other services. The other category is ways in which we can use AI as an assistive capability in the process of doing defense. One of the things that the big challenge when you think about how do you manage and reclaim the defender's advantage, a lot of it is information, right? We produce an enormous amount of information about our environment. It's very difficult to stay on top of it. One of the things that AI is very good at is categorization, summarization, and analysis. And what that allows us to do is to make sense of large amounts of information and to boil that down into consumable amounts of information or text, right? And change that for audiences so we can make it more technical, less technical for communication. That accelerates a lot of what we do on an analytic basis. How do we move faster to detect and respond, right? It accelerates that process. We can also use AI in the process of looking at testing. When we talked about validating controls, one of the things that we do with one of our services is what it basically does is it creates a digital twin of your cloud environment, and then it runs AI generated simulations. It's attack path analysis. And it's essentially looking at that same sort of validation or kind of combination of threat hunting together with control validation to help us understand and to do that quickly and comprehensively across a large amount of information. So I think what we're going to see is AI be a very powerful tool for the defender for making sense of things. The other area is, often in writing detections, we've had to have people understand things like URL syntax, right? They have a particular syntax to write a detection rule. That makes it difficult sometimes to onboard people. You've got to get people who really know that, and then you got to test it. So this notion of how can we start to use this natural language ability to make sense of threat intel and to write a detection in natural language and have it output by an AI model as actually properly formed and validated URL, right? And that allows for broader access and investigation and the creation of detections more easily. And we think that that's actually going to help take some of the workload out and help in some of that refinement. The same thing in terms of making sense of large volumes of threat intel and being able to ask questions around it so that you can form those kinds of hypotheses. So we see it. We recognize that it's both a crown jewel that needs to be protected, but it's also a powerful potential defensive weapon. One of the things that we did about, we're almost coming up on 2 years now, we put out this idea of the secure AI framework because people were saying, well, how do we begin to think about AI and ways of incorporating it? And really, I think, initially it was like, this is a strange thing, and it's not like all the other things. And what we've really spent time looking at is really trying to kind of demystify AI, and that's, kind of bring it, how do we think about it in the same context of other types of tools that we use across an enterprise? And so how can we begin to think about it and manage it within the context of the other types of defensive controls that we have? And that's why when I talk about this notion of data, infrastructure, model, and applications, we do, other than model protection, we do all the other three today, right? We might have to do it now slightly differently, but we do data protection, we do infrastructure protection, access control, segmentation, network controls, and we do application security, including, input validation and output. And so, but now we're changing that slightly because now that input starts to look a bit different, right? It's a prompt, or it may be an agentic deployment where I've got one model talking to another model, right? But it's fundamentally, we want people to be thinking about, how do we think about AI in the context of that? And really, we bring it into this construct of these 6 functions. And fundamentally, the short story in this is that it helps in the velocity of the work that we're doing. We think that it actually helps people move quicker because it removes the noise and some of the labor of assembly of information and putting structure around it in order to add context and understanding. The next area I'm going to briefly touch on is OT. And the reason I bring that up is because I think we've been generally slow in healthcare and life sciences of thinking about OT having a seat at the security table. But it becomes important, right? Because if I'm a threat actor and I take out your electronic medical record system, initially that was catastrophic, right? People didn't know what to do. Today, it's still incredibly disruptive, very difficult recovery process, but people have fallback mechanisms, right? They can go to paper charting, at least in many cases, right? But we lose some capability for doing things like medication interactions, drug allergies, drug-drug interactions, that sort of stuff. If an OT system, like an HVAC system, or power or water controls, pumps, are attacked, we actually can cause a cease of operations. So I can't even go to paper. I can't do care, right? I don't have the ability to safely keep people in a building in the wintertime or in the summertime. And so we want people to be thinking about this. And we've seen these kinds of attacks that look at both IT and OT assets. And either it's hitting an IT system that is controlling an OT system, or it's a direct attack on the OT systems. And so we want people to be thinking about this, at least be aware of it in the context of thinking about the threat landscape, and that there are these critical infrastructure systems that we want to make sure that we're at least collecting intelligence around, and to the degree that we can bring it into this cycle, bring it into this cycle. And OT systems have different behaviors, they have different protocols, but we want to at least be thinking about it in the course of kind of this notion of cyber resilience. A couple different key differences, very often OTs, the principal drivers in OT security are safety. It's operational continuity, right? And so we need to be thinking, about that, and how do we maintain life safety in many of these environments. So that's really ultimately what we're trying to do, is to get to this kind of maintain this kind of active cyber defense, and reclaim our advantage in this regard. And again, I do think that seeing some of the kinds of tooling going forward defensively with artificial intelligence to help us deal with some of this, and I think as well some of the tooling, I think will make this shift at least back in our direction. I think that, Kevin Mandy, who founded Mandiant, noted this thing that, we really, I think it, in some respects, there's an optimism here, right? Which is to really think about, like, this is our home court, right? And, we may have very worthy adversaries that are coming into our home court, but it is still our home court. And we need to think about what we can do to recapture and manage that defender's advantage. If you want to learn more, there's an ebook that's available, goes into much more depth around this. If you're also not aware, yesterday we released the M-Trends 2025 report that looks at threat activity that we've observed over the last year in the incident response activities that we've been doing as part of Mandiant's global threat response. And so that's also available as a free resource for people as well. And with that, I'll say thank you.
Hey, Bill, thank you so much. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions for Bill about this presentation or anything else regarding cybersecurity, please just drop it into the chat. We're happy to read that along. I wanted to say, I thought what I really appreciate about your presentation and your approach is so much of cybersecurity talk can be sort of fear-mongering is probably not quite the right word, because you got right to be scared, right? There's a lot going on. There are a lot of people trying to get in, but I think when you give folks a clear pathway and direction, along with a touch of optimism of reminding them, like, this is your home court, and that is, that little bit of optimism is really fantastic, and unfortunately kind of stands out. I know Tammy White is putting a request for the book link. Mike Donahue, thank you for jumping on that. Mike, I know you had a question for Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Bill, I wanted to ask, what advice would you give to a CISO or a CIO responsible for security operations at a health system that wants to operationalize this concept, but has a smaller resource constrained team?
Yeah, I mean, there was this concept.
The loaded question.
Yeah, no. I think it's a great question, because in a number of cases, I was the first security person in a company, and my job was to grow that organization within the budget that I was given, right? And so there's always this question of, okay, where do you start? I think a lot of it comes down to this is a question of scope, right? And I think it comes, it's looking at what are the most critical business functions that have to be preserved, that we can't lose. And I'd always begin with kind of what is the care mission, right? What is it that we have to be able to ensure we're doing no matter what? And And then I would build out from that. I would look at that as the initial scope of saying, okay, if that's, what can we do within that? So I would say, okay, I can't go do, worry about my HVAC security right now. Like, I just need to make sure that I have telemetry on the core clinical systems, that I could understand that, we have integrity of our lab, of our pharmacy, and of our imaging services, because I got to be able to run those. Even if I go onto paper for charting, I have equipment that has to operate to provide those ancillary services that are diagnostic related services. I'm blinding doctors and nurses without that. And so I'd probably look in those regards, and I'd say that's, what are we doing to make sure that we've got good kind of these practices, and the right intelligence around those types of services, the right detection. Do we have a procedure, response process for that? How quickly could we bring those systems back up if they were compromised? Could we operate them in some other way if we lost, kind of corporate internet? Is there a fallback telemetry or fallback internet connection? How would we do that? Do people know how to maintain those systems and bring those systems back from backup? Do we have our PAC system able to be restored? Those sorts of things. I mean, and then I would worry about bringing my scale out as I have the resources to do so. The other is that in a lot of cases, I got help. And so in most of the smaller organizations that I was part of, I leaned on MSSPs, managed security service providers, because I couldn't staff a security operations center. So I couldn't have eyes on glass 24/7. And so what I needed to do is get help to go do that, and negotiate on how we're going to do that telemetry and what those service levels are going to be, so that I have kind of first line support, and then I'm taking second and third line. And and that was helpful, because that was a way for me to go from, I didn't have the labor budget, and so but I had some OpEx, and I could get some OpEx to be able to allow me to do that, so I could go spend that on the OpEx. And then when I had the opportunity to bring that in, honestly, I didn't bring in SecOps. I kept a lot of the SecOps help out in smaller companies, because I had other areas where I needed to spend more focused time. So like in drug manufacturing, I was extremely concerned about the state of OT security that we had in the acquired plants. Like in most cases, they didn't have telemetry. And so I had to worry about that. And so I had to go get people to go do that. And it was better for me to continue to get help in those other areas. But I would say
That's
just
awesome, Bill.
really focus on the business. What is it that you got to keep going? Because I think in healthcare, more almost, up there with water and power, it's resiliency, right? And so we got a mission to deliver.
No, absolutely, Bill, and I really appreciate your insights on that. One other question I had as you were going through it, and especially given your roles as they've evolved over time and your experience in the consulting space, how have you seen incident response procedures improve when organizations can embrace this defender's advantage mindset? Have you seen incident response improvements when you have this methodology deployed?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, incident responders and any kind of person doing forensics and recovery, the worst situation you can find yourself in is no data. And so I think by thinking about this and looking at this from a threat-informed perspective and building the detection capabilities, you might have an event, but you're going to have a forensic, you're going to have a data set to help you in that forensic analysis. Like, go back to even this, this notion of restoration. if I'm going to sit there and respond to a compromise and I want to do restoration, if I don't know, if I have no ability to get to, patient zero, where the entry point was for the attacker, it's very difficult for me to understand, if I don't have a time date stamp on that, because I don't have any data on it, to know whether my backups are clean. And therefore, I'm not able to know for certain that I've eradicated the threat actor from my environment. And so if I've actually done really good work, back on, on this ability to get this intelligence in, and then to put it into play with detection, then now I've created the data set that now allows me to do the response processes. And that's the number one thing. Like, if I've had incident response responders into an environment that I've been the operator of, and in one case, it was a newly acquired facility. We didn't have the telemetry, and their hands are tied. So.
Thank you, Bill. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, I'll give out one last call for any questions from the audience, and I will pause 1 minute, but then I will continue on quickly and just thank Bill so much for joining us. Mike, thank you for helping. Also, appreciate your time. Also, again, if any of this spurred any thoughts, comments, concerns that you have, if CloudWave can help you in any way, shape, or form, please reach out to Mike or myself. You've also got Christine's email with this. We are happy to help you in any way possible. And Chris, is there anything else I forgot to mention?
I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for taking the time. We will follow up with an email that contains a link to a recording of this session, as well as a link to that Defender's Advantage ebook.
Well, thank you. Thank
Awesome.
you, CloudWave.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.